Hi everyone, welcome. During the last check-in with my so-called original red wiggler worms, we had a little bit of unfinished business, and we alluded to some of that unfinished business in the video. Some of it was already implied, I guess, as well. But what I've got to do with my original red wigglers, which now live in these two tubs over here. Here's one of the tubs that they used to live in. I just got done rinsing it out and it's here drying, but they were hauled out and they were separated from their castings to launch off these two new systems here, which have not been fed yet. So that's one of the to-do items today, which is to feed my two newest bins, which are 2 days old at this point. They've been living in here with no fresh food. I mean, the bedding and the leaves and whatnot is stuff that they can certainly use as food if they wish. So that's what I'm treating as the new business, but the old business pertaining to my original red wiggler worms is to pay a visit to the castings that those worms used to occupy, because we screened out the worms as well as any large chunk material that was left over in that stuff, and what was left is this beautiful batch of castings. But my screen is 1/4 inch, and what we noticed was a lot of worms dropping through the screen that still occupy this stuff over here. So the unfinished business that I'm referring to is initiating the process of baiting the straggler worms that still occupy that stuff right there. So we're going to start out with the so-called old business of setting up a bait box over here in the box full of their lovely castings, and then we'll proceed to the new business, which is feeding the two new 2-day-old worm bins with the original red wigglers. So I'm going to put a glove on. We'll get the box of castings out there in my bait box out, and we'll start with that. Perhaps it looks like I'm in an asteroid field or something, but no, I'm not doing special effects or trying to create the illusion of a space odyssey here. All I'm doing is showing you my bait boxes. I've got a shallow one and a deep one, and we're going to go with using the deep one today. And down within my bin there is space enough, if we wanted to deploy both, I suppose. But I guess the reason I'm only going to go with one is because around the bait box I like the idea of the castings themselves having access to the air so they can continue to dry. Because what I'll do once in a while is I'll return to the bait box, I'll pull it away, and then I'll stir up all the material so that the stuff that's been sitting out here drying for a few days can be blended in with the rest of the material. Each time I do that, the material down in the bin will get drier and drier over time, resulting in further motivation for the worms to want to get out of the castings themselves, and ideally they'll stumble on the bait box. So there's probably not a whole lot of mystery as to how one of these things might be set up, because the name of it already implies what it is that the thing is meant to accomplish, which is to bait the worms out of the material that they presently occupy and come on over and hang out in this stuff. So my prepared bedding that we're laying down a little bit of as a foundation is just a combination of shredded paper and cardboard, which I dampen. At the same time, I also drop in little tiny fragments of leaves that I separate from the larger ones by running that stuff through my little screen as well. And I've got an assortment of different food items here. Well, it's not a large assortment. It's really just a few chunks of pumpkin and some leaves of radish, which I figured might serve as a nice way to set up this bait box so that the worms, once they do come over, find a delicious bounty of delicious foods and nice bedding to occupy and hang out in and hopefully stay in. So besides the stuff from my freezer here, this assortment of pumpkin and radish leaves, I've also got my worm chow, which we could sprinkle a little bit of in here as well. Very nice. And not a whole lot remaining to do with the setup of a bait box. Just drop in a little bit more bedding, I guess. And we'll pretty much be done. So let's leave it at that, I suppose. In future check-ins, I'll probably not film it, but I will come in to make sure that the bait box is functioning as intended, which really just means, hey, some worms are actually getting drawn to it, and after entering it, they remain in it. But there's not a whole lot to it. That's pretty much your bait box. And different people might approach creating one of these things in various ways, but that's the way I do it. Perhaps the last thing I'll do after I've got it in position is I'll come in with my sprayer and dampen this stuff almost to the point where it's soaked, so that some of the moisture actually seeps down to the bottom and even starts coming through the holes on the bottom. And, you know, as a result, hopefully creating an environment that the worms are drawn to. Just the moisture initially, but over time, once they enter the box, the other things that they'll be hopefully enjoying is the nice fresh bedding and the fresh food. Stuff that these castings are pretty much devoid of at this point. Well, that's not really true if you think about it, because the interesting thing about worms is that they create these lovely worm casts so quickly. The foods that they eat go through their body so fast that what comes out the other side, the worm castings, are still loaded with so much nutritional value that they can just turn right around and eat that once again, over and over, I believe up to 6 or 7 times, because of the residual nutritional value that remains in this stuff. So how many times these castings have already been possibly re-ingested and re-eaten, I don't know. But I would imagine that the stuff still has a good amount of food substance remaining in it that the worms can continue to make use of, and it's for that reason I feel that promoting the drying of this stuff is quite possibly the strongest thing that causes the worms to want to leave it, you know. So in a way, we're triggering a little bit of a attraction response. So the worms are hopefully attracted to the moisture of the bait box and then remain in the bait box because of the lovely bedding and food they find in it. But I do feel that the other very strong, possibly even the more important reaction we're trying to invoke in the worms is the tendency to be repulsed by the material that they're in, and that's really the drying aspect of it that I think is quite important. So I've created a little bit of a recess into which we could drop the bait box right there, and there are some openings and holes that I punched. So there's so this one doesn't really have openings. This shallower one I noticed does have openings on the corners here. This deeper one doesn't, but I did actually perforate the sides of the thing too, and it's for that reason I do like to drop it down into the material a little bit, since there's access points there as well for the worms to be able to come into the bait box. And, you know, as I was tilling through the material, we saw a few worms hanging out. I'm not quite sure how many worms to expect when the day comes to finally haul this bait box out of here. And at that point, we'll be able to really consider this as a batch of castings that we can harvest in such a way that we're rest assured that we've gotten all the worms out of it. But that's pretty much all there is to it. So let's grab my spray bottle. It's right here within reach, and it's all charged up with pressure. It's really just a matter of just hitting the trigger and dispensing the moisture. And like I said, we're going to be leaving this castings material uncovered so that it can continue to dry, and I'll check in here periodically to take the box out, stir things around, and hopefully further promote the drying of this material that's down in the box by blending in the stuff that's out on the surface and has been allowed to dry. And the only thing I wanted to do now is to cover up. In the past I've covered up with plastic. I figured maybe we can get as good coverage with just a piece of cardboard. Why not? So that's pretty much it for initiating the baiting of the worms out of this material. So I'm going to set this back up on the shelf. I'll check in every so often to stir up the material, hopefully driving its moisture level down and down over time to the point where the stuff has become so dry that the worms really don't want to be in it. And this right here is going to be the only game in town as far as a nice comfortable place to be. So let's get this thing out of the way. We'll get the two new systems out on the bench and we're going to get them fed. The video that I made of us separating the worms from their old castings and then releasing them into these two new systems was where I actually polled the viewers to let me know what they thought in terms of how many worms occupy these systems. So here we might not get as good a view of how many worms live in these two bins, but that video from last time would probably show it a little bit better, because when they got released into here with all this familiar material that came along for the ride, the stuff that got caught in the screen, we were stirring it all around here and spreading it around, so we got a pretty good view of the worms. So, you know, I would always invite people to go check out that video. So I'll put a link up here in the corner of that video, and if you haven't done so already, definitely watch it and then let me know how many worms you think we released into these systems. I'm always looking forward to hearing everyone's feedback. Sometimes I launch new systems like this and then I wait a week or more before I first check in on them. And then very recently I've had an occasion where the worms just for whatever reason couldn't get acclimated to the new material that they were invited to occupy and consider as their new home. And because of that, they sort of just sat out on the top surface, huddled together. And in that case, that most recent case that comes to mind with my African night crawlers, the poor worms really had none of this old familiar material that came along with them as part of the screening process. I took a little bit extra effort to try to get the worms separated from all the material that was surrounding them so that I can get a really good look at how many there were, and then I think I might have even weighed them or something like that. But it was regrettable that those poor worms had no familiar material to remain in, because the bedding that I had prepared for them seemed to be tainted in some way, and they were just simply unable to make themselves at home in that stuff. So what I'm really trying to gauge right now is whether or not the worms have been able to accept the new bedding underneath the familiar material, and are they occupying it? Are they seemingly content in the stuff? And I'm, you know, just pulling back a handful of stuff, going right to the bottom to see what I see. And I can already see worms down at the very bottom, kind of enjoying some of the pooled up material, pooled up moisture that's down there. So this was just something I wanted to do before blending all this stuff together, just to make sure that there was nothing weird about the bedding material that I had prepped for them. This shredded paper, cardboard, and leaf mixture sat in this bin for a week prior to the worms being introduced, and right before I dropped in the worms, or maybe right after, I forget, I did take some fluid and I just dropped it in here, and that's the reason we're seeing a little bit of standing water at the bottom. And it does seem like the worms really do like that. They like to go right down there and go play around, splash in those little puddles, and eventually those puddles just get absorbed into the surrounding material, but sometimes the puddles do remain down there, and I always find that the worms really like playing around in some of that standing water while it lasts. I generally try my best not to have standing water in any of my systems, but in a brand new bin like these, I don't see the harm in having a little bit, especially since the worms do seem to really enjoy hanging out in this stuff. So I blended in a lot of this familiar material that came along with the worms from their old homes. And before we get on to checking out bin number 1, we just checked in on what's labeled as bin number 2. For me, left to right from where I'm standing always seems to result in me heading over to bin number 2 and starting there. I have to remind myself that, hey, from your point of view, bin number 1 is over on this side. So I opened up a little bit of a hole here into which we can drop today's feeding, and now we can go make sure things are coming along good in bin number 1 as well, similarly. So I really have no reason to expect anything different. So when I'm setting up bins like these that are set up as sort of brother bins or sister bins, or perhaps even twin bins if the estimated worm count comes out to be even or the same, then it's fair to expect similar outcomes in both systems. And it is nice to see worms enjoying all the material, not only the familiar stuff that they came along with, but also the nice damp fresh bedding that we prepared for them in these bins. I suppose by blending stuff like this, a lot of the really damp stuff that's sitting down at the bottom is getting blended in with some of the stuff that's not quite as damp up higher, so perhaps these little standing puddles are going to be a thing of the past. So apologies, wormies, for messing up your little fun playground of standing water. Maybe there will be a little bit left for them to enjoy for a little bit longer. But let's also, there's a whole bunch of wormies right down the middle. Usually when I set up a system like this with no food or anything like that, I expect to not encounter any sort of worm balls, but here it does seem like the worms have huddled together to a certain point. But as long as there's stuff around them and they're not actually just a mass of worms only, I don't worry. It's when there's just a big pile of worms, they're not, commingled with the surrounding materials that I grow worried, because that's a defensive behavior of the worms when they kind of pile up on top of each other and don't want to come in contact with the materials that are surrounding them. And that's the times when you need to pay a little bit closer attention to the stuff that they're being expected to occupy. Perhaps there's something about this stuff that they're just unable to tolerate, and that's the reason they're just trying to get away from it. So originally I thought that we might not add bedding as part of this feeding, because it seems like these systems are chock full of nice fresh bedding for them. But you know what? I think I'm going to grab my supply of bedding, which I've already returned to the shelf. I didn't think we would need it, so I returned it to the shelf, but I think we will just go ahead and supplement today's feeding with at least a handful of fresh bedding onto which we can drop the frozen foods. I think just the fact that the stuff came from my freezer is the reason my idea of dropping the food onto something other than the worms themselves would be a kind of a nice way to play it. So here's what I've got for them. It's a pretty huge assortment of stuff from my freezer. And I guess we'll just try to divide it up evenly. Give them some of these leaves of leeks, I believe those might be. And there's chunks of red cabbage here. Here's a spoiled tomato. I see the peels of white and orange carrot. There's even the little stem end of a carrot with the leaves on there. Hopefully by freezing these things we're going to stifle any growth. Even sometimes when I put cabbage into my worm bins, the stuff just starts growing. So potato too. Some of these potato peels, if they'd not been frozen before getting put in here, they could have started growing. But I believe by freezing the stuff before handing it off to the wormies, you reduce the likelihood of this stuff trying to continue growing down within the worm bins. Somehow it seems like bin number 2 over here received a bit more, so I'm just going to grab a little bit of stuff and bring it over to bin number 1 so that I feel like I've been fair in the distribution of the foods for them. And what I've got here is crushed eggshell. Crushed eggshell is the form of grit that I use in my systems. Usually you don't see such a powdery and dusty cloud when I'm applying my pulverized eggshell into my worm bins, and that's because I usually go to the extra effort of trying to reduce the dusty material in my pulverized eggshells, and that's just a process I didn't really follow through or deploy in the creation of this batch of material, so it is going to be a little bit dustier and messier, unless I finally get sick of having all the dust flying around, and maybe I take this stuff outside and process it the way I do to get rid of the dusty membrane portions of the eggshell that wind up in the concoction after you grind it all up. So here again, I figured if I'm going to bring in some of the surrounding materials to cover up with, then I might be bringing worms on top of a pile of frozen foods, which they might not appreciate, so I figured let's just cover up the feeding over here with just some more of my prepared bedding. And, well, you know what? Here's some more of my worm chow. It's still out here on the bench. We applied a little bit to the bait box earlier. Let's give them a little bit of this as well to coat off the fresh bedding that we threw in there. So let's try to return all this stuff down into the bins, because otherwise it just ends up getting rinsed off and flushed down the drain. Stuff belongs in the worm bins, not down the drain. So that's it now for our initiation of baiting of the straggler worms in the finished batch of castings that we harvested from the old homes that these wormies used to occupy. And this is also the first feeding of the wormies in their new home, where they do appear to be pretty content, as far as I can tell. Starting to occupy the material, appearing to be pretty content in it, and now they've got their first feeding. So that's it for the video, everyone. Don't forget, I'll be leaving that link up there, so be sure to click in the corner to follow that. And check out that video if you haven't done so already, and let me know how many worms you think occupy these systems. I'm always looking forward to hearing from everyone. But that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.